Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the incredible journey of a woman who found herself caught in a contract marriage with a powerful billionaire. She never imagined that this arrangement would lead her to something real, a love that could change her life forever. It was an ordinary day in the office when Natalie first received the call. She sat in her small apartment, a cup of half-finished coffee sitting untouched on the desk in front of her. With her hands trembling slightly, she answered, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But what came next was anything but ordinary. "I need you to marry me," the voice on the other end of the line said, calm but firm. Natalie blinked, sure she hadn't heard him correctly. The voice continued, "It's not about love, it's a business arrangement. I'll take care of everything, but you need to be my wife for the next 6 months. In return, you'll get a generous sum to help secure your future." She felt the world tilt as her mind raced. This was absurd, but it wasn't like she had any other options. With her debts piling up, her father's failing health, and no other clear path in sight, she felt the weight of desperation closing in. Without a second thought, she agreed. Her life was about to change, but she had no idea just how much. The man on the other side of the phone call, Henry Walker, was a billionaire CEO, one of the wealthiest men in the city. A man whose name she had only seen in the headlines. Tall, strikingly handsome, and notorious for his ruthless business tactics, Henry was the kind of man who seemed to have it all, except, perhaps, for a genuine connection. Natalie wasn't sure why she'd agreed to marry him, but she had. And so, with a heavy heart, she prepared herself for a life she didn't expect. The day of their wedding arrived too soon. Natalie stood in front of the mirror in her modest dress, a dress she'd chosen carefully, knowing it wasn't anything like the designer gown she'd seen on TV. She had no illusions about this marriage. It wasn't about love, it was about survival. The weight of the ring she now wore felt heavier than she expected, a symbol of the contract she'd signed in desperation. Her eyes met her reflection in the mirror, and for the first time, she wondered if this was really the right decision. But there was no turning back. She had agreed, and now, she was bound to this man in a way that had nothing to do with affection. It was all about the business, the promise, and the money. As she walked into the grand hall where the ceremony was to take place, she caught a glimpse of Henry at the altar, dressed in his immaculate suit, looking every bit the powerful, wealthy man that he was. His cold blue eyes met hers for a brief moment, but there was no warmth in them, only the quiet, calculated gaze of a man who had long ago stopped believing in the things that made life worth living. This wasn't the start of a fairy tale. It was the start of a deal. And yet, as Natalie stood by his side, something stirred inside her, a flicker of hope that perhaps this wasn't as simple as it seemed. She had no idea that her decision to marry this man would change both their lives in ways they could never have predicted. They said their vows, quick, simple, and void of emotion. But as Natalie looked up at Henry, standing beside him in that cold, empty church, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than she'd originally thought. After all, this was just the beginning. And in the silence between them, she couldn't help but feel a strange, unexpected connection. But it was nothing more than a fleeting thought, soon replaced by the harsh reality of their contract. But little did Natalie know, Henry was about to show her something she never expected. Beneath his cold exterior, a man who had buried his emotions long ago, Henry began to see Natalie in a way he had never seen anyone before. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, and it was beginning to stir something deep inside him. And with that, their journey began, one that would lead them both down a path of unexpected love, transformation, and self-discovery. The business contract they had signed, which seemed so clear and straightforward, would soon be tested by the undeniable pull of human connection. For what started as a marriage of convenience would slowly evolve into something far more complex, and far more meaningful, than either of them could ever have imagined. The days following the wedding passed in a blur for Natalie. Each day felt like she was walking through a fog, her every step guided by the cold, calculated rules of the contract she had signed. The mansion she now called home felt distant and impersonal, like a place that wasn't hers, no matter how much she tried to fit into its lavish surroundings. She had expected this, expected the cold distance from Henry, but something about it still left her feeling hollow inside. She had agreed to this arrangement for financial security, for the promise of a future she couldn't afford to lose, but every night when she lay awake in the giant bed, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. It wasn't about the money, it wasn't about the mansion. It was the loneliness that settled deep in her chest. She was living with a man who hardly spoke to her, who treated her with polite indifference, and yet, somehow, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table in silence, Natalie caught a glimpse of Henry's face as he absent-mindedly stirred his wine. There was a heaviness to his expression, an emotional weight that seemed to be pulling him down. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that fleeting connection, something shifted. He didn't speak, but there was a vulnerability in his gaze that took Natalie by surprise. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but it was a crack in the wall he had built around himself. The ice that had kept him so distant seemed to be melting, just a little. It was subtle, but it was there. And for the first time, Natalie felt a pang of curiosity. Who was Henry Walker really? And why did she feel like there was more to this contract than he was letting on? Weeks passed, and the distance between them began to feel less like a chasm and more like a challenge. Henry's meetings and phone calls often kept him busy late into the night, leaving Natalie alone in the grand house with nothing but her thoughts for company. She spent her time filling the hours with work of her own, taking up painting again, something she hadn't done in years. It was a small act of rebellion against the sterile world she had entered. The canvases she created were filled with bright colors, wild strokes of passion that contrasted sharply with the sterile, orderly life she was now leading. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Natalie found herself in the art studio, her brush sweeping across the canvas. It was then that she heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hall. She turned, half expecting to see a servant or perhaps the housekeeper. But instead, there stood Henry, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. He hadn't said a word, but the way he stood there, his eyes softening as he took in the sight of her work, made her heart race in a way she didn't expect. "You paint?" he asked, his voice low, almost surprised. Natalie set down her brush, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't expected him to show any interest in something so personal to her. "I did, before," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I stopped for a while, but it feels good to pick it up again." Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked into the room, closer to her painting. He stood there for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he examined her work. Finally, he spoke. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "I didn't expect that." For a moment, the world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them in the quiet of the room. There was something about the way he looked at her, something almost tender. Natalie couldn't help but wonder, was he really the same man who had signed a contract with her, who had treated her with such coldness and detachment? Was there a side of him that even he didn't know existed? "Thank you," she said softly, her voice a little shaky. "It's just something I do when I need to feel something." Henry's gaze softened, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller. "I understand," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "I used to feel like that too, but I buried it a long time ago." It was strange, hearing him speak so openly. It was a side of Henry she hadn't seen before, vulnerable, open, human. It didn't make sense, but in that moment, it felt like they were both two people stuck in a world they didn't want to be in, desperately trying to find a way out. As the night wore on, they talked. Not about contracts, not about business, but about life, about what they wanted, what they feared, and how they had ended up where they were. And for the first time since the wedding, Natalie felt like she was seeing the real Henry Walker. It was a side of him she hadn't expected, but one that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, this marriage could be about more than just a piece of paper. But the more they talked, the more Natalie realized something. It wasn't just Henry who had changed. She had, too. She had spent so much time focused on surviving, on getting through each day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to really live. Henry's presence, his vulnerability, it made her want to take risks, to feel alive again. And yet, As much as their connection grew, the question still lingered in the back of her mind. Could this ever be real? Could a marriage born out of necessity ever turn into something more? The answer, as always, was unclear. But for now, they had each other. And sometimes that was enough. The days continued to pass, and with each one, Natalie found herself growing more comfortable in Henry's presence. They were still bound by the contract they had signed, but something had shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was a connection, a deeper understanding that neither of them had expected. It wasn't just the conversations in the art studio anymore. They shared small moments, like catching each other's eye across the dinner table or walking together through the garden in the late afternoon. These moments felt real, not like the rehearsed, cold exchanges they had at the beginning of their arrangement. One evening, after another long day of meetings and business calls, Henry walked into the living room where Natalie was sitting, her sketchbook open in front of her. He looked exhausted, but there was something else in his eyes, something that Natalie couldn't quite place. He stood there for a moment, watching her as she doodled, a small smile playing on his lips. "You've been busy," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Natalie glanced up, her hand halting mid-stroke. She smiled softly, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. "Just passing the time," she replied, trying to keep her voice light. "What about you? More work?" Henry's expression darkened slightly, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. He walked over to the couch and sat down, still watching her. "I've been trying to keep my mind off things," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Sometimes it feels like I'm running on autopilot. The business, the responsibilities, it all feels like a weight I can't escape." Natalie felt a pang of sympathy for him. She had seen the weight of his life, the isolation he carried with him. It was easy to forget that behind the cold exterior, there was a man who, like her, had his own struggles, his own fears. She closed the sketchbook and set it aside, turning to face him. "I understand," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been there too. You don't have to carry it all alone." For a moment, Henry didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his gaze softening. It was the first time he had let his guard down like this. For the first time since they had met, he didn't look at her like an object to be used, but as someone who truly understood. "Maybe I don't," he said quietly, finally breaking the silence. "Maybe I've been too used to doing things on my own." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with a new intensity. "But I'm starting to realize I don't have to anymore. Not with you here." Natalie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this honesty, this raw vulnerability. It was like he was opening up to her in a way he hadn't with anyone in years, maybe ever. She could feel the shift between them, a change that neither of them had anticipated when this whole thing started. Henry leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his expression thoughtful. "I know this started as a contract," he continued, his voice a little rough. "But somewhere along the way, I think we both forgot it was just that." He let out a soft laugh, almost as if he was surprised by his own words. "I'm not saying I expect anything more, but I think we've both found something real here. Maybe not love, but something worth holding on to." For a moment, there was only silence, and in that silence, Natalie felt her heart race. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure what this was, this feeling that had started to grow between them. But in that moment, she realized that, just like Henry, she didn't want to let it go. She had spent so long building walls around herself, guarding her heart. But with him, this strange, complicated man, those walls were starting to crack. "I think I agree," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "We've built something, not perfect, but real." Henry nodded, the weight of his words settling between them. "Exactly. It's messy, but it's ours." He stood up, walking over to her, and for a moment, Natalie thought he might say something more, something deeper. But instead, he simply smiled, genuinely, without the cold detachment he had carried with him for so long. "I'm glad we're doing this," he said, his voice low and sincere. Natalie smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't sure where this was heading, what would happen next. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. They were two people, broken in different ways, but finding something together, something more than either of them had expected. As the evening wore on, the world outside their mansion seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the quiet connection they had started to build. Natalie wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time since their marriage began, she felt hopeful. This wasn't a contract anymore. It was something far more real, something that had the potential to change both of their lives forever. The days that followed were a strange mix of uncertainty and quiet warmth. The mansion, which once felt like an imposing cage, began to feel like something more, something that, for the first time, might actually be home. Natalie had grown accustomed to the grandeur around her, the polished floors and high ceilings. But it was the small moments with Henry that began to make her feel grounded. She never imagined that this contract marriage would lead to something resembling companionship, but here she was, spending evenings in the same space, having actual conversations, not about business, not about the terms of their agreement, but about life, dreams, and even their fears. Henry had begun to open up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing things about his childhood, his early struggles before becoming the billionaire CEO he was now. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was a tenderness between them, a quiet understanding that grew with each passing day. One evening, as they sat together in the library, the soft glow of the fire casting shadows on the walls, Henry looked over at Natalie. He had that familiar faraway look in his eyes, the one he wore when his mind was preoccupied with something beyond their conversations. Natalie had gotten used to these moments, where he would retreat into himself, but tonight, it felt different. She waited, sensing that something was about to shift. "You know," Henry began, his voice a little more serious than usual, "I've been thinking about what you said a while ago, about not having to carry everything alone." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I'm not used to relying on anyone, but," he trailed off, his hand running through his hair in that familiar, anxious way. Natalie looked up from her book, meeting his gaze. There was something vulnerable in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. She put the book down and leaned forward slightly, offering him the space to continue. "I've always thought I could handle everything on my own," he said quietly. "But these last few months, having you here, seeing things from your perspective, it's made me realize that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I've been doing it all wrong." Natalie's heart ached as she watched him. His usually confident and stoic demeanor cracked, revealing the man who was still learning to trust. She knew the walls he had built around himself, the layers of control he had maintained for years to protect himself from the world. But in this moment, those walls seemed to be crumbling. "It's okay to not have everything figured out," she said softly, her voice steady. "We don't have to have it all together all the time. I've learned that, too. Life doesn't work that way." Henry nodded slowly, taking in her words. For a long moment, they simply sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. There was a sense of peace in the room, a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected. The contract they had signed was still there, lingering in the background, but for the first time, it didn't seem to matter as much. Days passed, and slowly, things between them continued to change. Natalie found herself thinking less about the terms of their agreement and more about the person sitting across from her, the man who, despite all his wealth and power, still had his own fears and vulnerabilities. He wasn't the same man she had first met, cold, distant, and almost unreachable. No, Henry was different now. There was a softness in his eyes when he looked at her, a gentleness that made her wonder if this marriage, which had started as a mere business arrangement, might just lead to something more. One afternoon, Natalie was in the garden, tending to the flowers Henry had insisted on planting. It had been his idea to bring a touch of nature into the sterile environment of the mansion, and Natalie had found peace in the quiet act of gardening. She had just finished planting a row of roses when Henry came outside, his footsteps soft against the grass. He stood at the edge of the garden, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You've really taken to this," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "It's hard to imagine you doing this when we first met." Natalie smiled, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I didn't think I'd be the type to enjoy something like this either, but it's peaceful. It helps me clear my mind." She looked up at him, noticing the way his eyes softened as he watched her. "It's nice, isn't it?" she added, her voice gentle. Henry nodded, stepping closer. "It is. I never realized how much I needed peace in my life until I started spending time with you." He paused, his gaze shifting from her to the roses she had just planted. "I've spent so long chasing things, money, success, control, that I forgot what really matters." He looked back at her, his expression sincere. Maybe I've been running from the wrong things all along. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, and in that quiet space, Natalie felt something shift again between them. She wasn't sure where this was heading, but for the first time, she didn't need to know. They were taking it one step at a time, and that felt enough for now. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Henry reached out and gently touched her arm. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Natalie looked at him, and for the first time, she felt like she truly saw him. The man behind the suit and the business meetings, the man who had opened up to her in ways she hadn't expected. Maybe it wasn't love yet, but there was something real between them, and that was a start. The weeks that followed felt like a slow unraveling of everything Natalie thought she knew about herself, about Henry, and about what it meant to truly be seen. Their connection had grown stronger, deeper, in ways neither of them had anticipated when they first signed that contract. They still lived under the same roof, still wore the rings that symbolized the legal bond they had entered into, but it felt like something had shifted in the fabric of their relationship. The walls that once kept them at arm's length were slowly, quietly coming down. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions. Instead, there was just the steady, gentle growth of something real, something more than either of them had planned. One evening, after a long day, Natalie found herself in the kitchen preparing dinner. The house was quieter than usual, the usual hum of phone calls and meetings absent for the moment. She was cutting vegetables, her movements automatic, when Henry appeared in the doorway. His presence was familiar now, but still, there was something about the way he stood there, watching her, that made her heart race. It wasn't the cold, detached gaze she had seen when they first met. It was different now, more open, more present. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice soft, as if unsure of his place in this quiet domestic moment. Natalie looked up, surprised by the question. Henry was a man who had always been in control, always commanding attention in any room he walked into. To see him standing there, asking if he could help her cook dinner, felt like a small but significant change. "Sure," she replied, giving him a smile that felt more genuine than it had in days. "Just chop these up, please." She handed him the knife and the cutting board, and for a moment, they worked side by side in silence, the only sound the soft click of the knife against the board. It was a simple moment, but in that simplicity, Natalie realized just how much had changed between them. It wasn't the grand gestures or the passionate declarations of love that defined their relationship. It was these quiet, shared moments that felt more real than anything else. As Henry sliced the vegetables, their hands occasionally brushed, and she could feel the warmth in the touch, the unspoken connection that had grown between them. "You know," Henry said after a moment, his voice low, "I never thought I'd be doing something like this, standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with my wife." His words were light, teasing, but there was an honesty in them that caught Natalie off guard. He wasn't just talking about the act of cooking. He was talking about the life they had started to build together, a life that, despite its unusual beginnings, was becoming more real with each passing day. Natalie smiled, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. It was strange, this feeling that had taken root in her chest. It wasn't love yet, not in the way people usually talked about love, but it was something, a connection that ran deeper than she had ever expected. She hadn't been looking for this. She hadn't been looking for him. But here they were, two people who had entered into a contract, now slowly realizing that they had built something far more meaningful than they had planned. As they sat down to dinner that night, a quiet sense of contentment settled over them. They talked about nothing in particular, about the weather, about plans for the weekend, about the books they were reading, but in those small moments, there was a depth that hadn't been there before. They weren't just two people living in the same house anymore. They were two people sharing a life, slowly learning to trust each other, learning to open up, learning to be vulnerable. The next few days felt like a continuation of the same quiet rhythm. They didn't rush anything. They didn't try to force anything. They simply existed together, slowly discovering new things about each other. Henry began to share more about his past, the struggles he had faced before becoming the successful everyone knew him as. He talked about the loneliness that had come with his wealth, the isolation he had felt despite being surrounded by people who only saw him as a means to an end. Natalie listened, her heart aching for him in a way she hadn't expected. "I've spent so much time building walls around myself," Henry said one evening, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought it was the only way to survive in this world. But now I see it's just made me more isolated. More alone." Natalie placed a hand on his, her touch gentle. "I understand," she said softly. "I've built my own walls too. But maybe we don't have to do it alone anymore." Henry's gaze softened as he looked at her, a silent understanding passing between them. It was a quiet promise, a promise that they didn't have to carry their burdens alone anymore. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real. And for the first time since their marriage began, Natalie didn't feel like she was just going through the motions. She felt like she was truly living, truly connecting with someone who, despite all his wealth and success, was just as human as she was. As the evening came to a close, they sat together on the couch, the silence between them comfortable. The world outside felt distant, as if they were in their own little bubble, separated from the chaos of everything else. And for the first time in a long while, Natalie felt at peace. Maybe this wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was her life now. And for the first time, she felt like it was enough. It was a Saturday morning when Natalie woke up to find Henry already sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. The soft rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the room. But despite the peaceful setting, Henry looked tense, his brow furrowed, his thoughts clearly far away. She stood there for a moment, watching him, wondering what was going on inside his mind. They had come so far, but there was still a part of him that remained closed off, still distant in ways that she couldn't reach. Slowly, she moved toward the counter to make herself some coffee, breaking the silence between them. "Morning," she said, her voice soft, but it was enough to pull him out of his thoughts. Henry turned to her, his expression softening when he saw her, but there was still a hint of something, an unease, a restlessness, that lingered behind his eyes. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in hours. "I was just thinking." He gestured toward the window. "About everything, really." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm on the edge of something, like there's this whole other world out there, and I'm stuck in this one." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Natalie placed her mug on the counter, her heart aching for him. She had seen him struggle before, seen the weight of his world bearing down on him. But this was different. There was something more personal in his words today, something that felt deeper. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice gentle, but steady. Henry sighed and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He seemed torn, like he didn't know how to put his feelings into words. "I've spent so much of my life focusing on success, on the business, on the image I've built for myself, that I've forgotten what really matters. I've isolated myself from everything that actually makes life worth living." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "You've shown me that, Natalie. You've shown me that there's more to life than the things I've been chasing. And I don't know how to handle it. I don't know how to handle these feelings." He looked away again, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup, as though it was the only thing holding him together. Natalie felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She could see it, the vulnerability he was allowing himself to show. This wasn't the man she had first met, the man who guarded his emotions like a fortress. This was Henry, the man who was learning to open up, to face the parts of himself he had long buried. It wasn't easy for him, she knew that, but the fact that he was trying meant everything. "Henry," she said softly, her voice full of understanding. "It's okay to feel lost sometimes. It's okay to not have everything figured out. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She paused, stepping closer to him. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We're figuring it out together, one step at a time. And that's enough." Henry's eyes met hers again, and for a moment, there was a quiet stillness between them, a moment where everything else in the world fell away, and it was just the two of them. His shoulders seemed to relax, the tension in his posture easing, as if her words had given him permission to let go of some of the weight he had been carrying. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said, his voice quiet, almost as if he were admitting something he had never allowed himself to say before. Natalie smiled softly, feeling a surge of affection for him. "You don't have to worry about that," she replied. "We're in this together." She reached out, her hand gently resting on his. It was a simple touch, but it meant more than anything. The quiet between them stretched on, but it was comfortable, filled with an understanding that neither of them had expected to find. Natalie didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. They were no longer strangers. They were partners. They were building something real, something that was slowly becoming more than a contract, more than a business arrangement. As the day wore on, the weight of the conversation lingered in the back of Natalie's mind. She couldn't help but think about how far they had come since that first meeting, when everything had been so cold and distant. Back then, she had thought this would be a marriage of convenience, something that would allow her to survive, nothing more. But now, she wasn't so sure. There was something there, something she hadn't expected, but something that felt undeniable. A connection, built slowly, over time, through the small moments, through the quiet understanding that had blossomed between them. For the first time, Natalie allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't feel like a contract, but a partnership. A future where she and Henry were not just two people living in the same house, but two people building something together, side by side. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't as impossible as she had once thought. The weeks continued to pass by, and with each day, the connection between Natalie and Henry grew deeper. Their marriage, which had once been nothing more than a contract, now felt more like a partnership, one built on understanding, shared moments, and quiet intimacy. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had moved beyond the cold formalities, and slowly, the walls between them had crumbled. What had started as a business arrangement was now evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. One afternoon, as they sat together in the library, the weight of their unspoken words seemed to fill the room. Natalie could sense that Henry was wrestling with something, an internal struggle that he had yet to put into words. She had noticed this in recent days, the way he would become lost in thought, his eyes distant as if grappling with a decision that loomed over him. She sat beside him, quietly observing, unsure whether to press him on it or to wait for him to speak. Henry finally broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking," he said, his gaze shifting from the book in his hands to the window. "About everything. About us. And about the future." He paused, the words hanging in the air between them. "I know we're not there yet. I know that we're still figuring things out. But I can't help but wonder, could this really turn into something more than we've both expected?" Natalie's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had been feeling the shift between them, too, the way they had become more than just two people living under the same roof. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing him acknowledge the possibility of something more, made her feel vulnerable in a way she hadn't been prepared for. She looked at him, her voice quiet, but filled with sincerity. "I've been wondering the same thing," she admitted, her gaze meeting his. "At first, I thought this was just about survival. But now," she faltered, unsure how to express what she was feeling. "Now I don't know. I don't know what this is, but I know it's not just a contract anymore. It's something real, and I think we both feel that." Henry's eyes softened, and for the first time, Natalie saw the vulnerability he had kept hidden for so long. The stoic CEO, the man who had once been so distant, was finally showing her a side of himself that no one else had seen. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I was afraid of," he said, his words laced with a quiet intensity. "I've spent so much of my life building walls to keep people out, to protect myself from getting hurt. But you've made me see that maybe those walls aren't the answer. Maybe letting someone in, maybe letting myself feel, is the way forward." Natalie felt her breath catch in her throat as she processed his words. For so long, she had watched him struggle, watched him fight against his own emotions. But now, there was a sense of openness between them, a vulnerability that felt like a bridge finally being built between their two worlds. She reached out, placing a hand gently on his. "You don't have to be afraid," she said softly. "We've been taking this one step at a time, and we'll keep doing that. Together." Henry gave a small nod, his gaze locked on hers, and for a moment, everything else in the room seemed to fade away. It wasn't the world of wealth and power that defined them anymore. It was just the two of them, standing on the edge of something neither of them fully understood, but both were willing to explore. The next few days felt different. It wasn't just the small, everyday moments that had changed. It was the way they interacted, more openly, more honestly. They weren't hiding behind their pasts anymore. They were facing each other with the raw truth of who they were and who they could be together. The question that had lingered between them for so long, whether this could ever be more than just a contract, was slowly beginning to feel less like a question and more like an answer. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Henry turned to her, his expression more serious now than it had been before. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I know one thing. I want you in it. For whatever comes next." Natalie smiled, her heart swelling, with something she couldn't quite describe. "I want that too," she replied, her voice steady, filled with a warmth that mirrored the sunset before them. "Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you." And in that moment, they both knew that their journey had only just begun. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of anticipation. For the first time, Natalie and Henry were no longer just two people fulfilling a contract. They were partners, walking side by side into a future neither of them had expected. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of hesitation, but they were learning to trust each other in ways that felt more genuine with each passing day. Their connection had deepened, and although they still hadn't put a name to it, there was an undeniable bond forming between them. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every glance across the room, it all felt like a piece of something bigger, something real. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden together, the sun warm on their faces, Henry broke the comfortable silence between them. "I've been thinking about the next steps," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty. "About what this means. About what we've been building." He paused, looking down at his hands, almost as if he were gathering the courage to say something important. "I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to just exist next to you in this house. I want us to truly be a part of each other's lives. I want to share everything with you. The good, the bad, everything. I think it's time we stop hiding behind what this started as and face the truth of what we've become." Natalie's heart skipped a beat at his words. She hadn't expected him to say this, but hearing him finally acknowledge the depth of what they had shared made something shift inside her. This was it. This was the moment when everything would either move forward or fall apart. She took a deep breath, meeting his eyes. "I've been thinking about that too," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "At first, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know where this was going. But now I know. I don't want to just be a part of your world. I want us to build something real together. I want this to be more than just a contract. I want to take that leap, Henry. Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you." She paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I want to be with you, not just because of this marriage, but because of everything we've built together. Because I believe in what we've become." Henry looked at her, his expression softening as her words sunk in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the soft hum of the world around them filled the silence. But in that moment, it was as if time stood still. "You know," he said quietly, "I was scared. I was scared that if I opened up, if I allowed myself to feel something real, I might lose control. But with you," he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "With you, I'm starting to understand that maybe control isn't what matters. Maybe love, trust, and honesty are what we need." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I don't want to keep holding back. I want to move forward with you." His voice was steady now, but there was a hint of vulnerability in it that made Natalie's heart ache. In that moment, Natalie knew. She knew that this was it. This was the leap they had both been hesitant to take. But now, with everything laid bare between them, there was no turning back. They had faced their fears, their doubts, and had come out on the other side, stronger, more connected. "I'm ready," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Let's do this. Together." She smiled, her heart full of warmth as she looked at him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real, and that was enough. And for the first time since their marriage began, they were no longer living in the shadows of a contract. They were living in the light of something real. Something that had been built, slowly but surely, with trust, with love, and with the promise of a future that was theirs to create. Weeks passed, and with each day, the connection between Natalie and Henry grew stronger. What had started as a contract, two people coming together for security and convenience, had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted. They had faced challenges, but together, they had learned. to navigate through them, discovering in the process that the foundation they had built was not just about surviving, but thriving. As they continued to share their lives, it became clear that the bond they had formed was no longer just a result of necessity. It was a true partnership, one grounded in respect, trust, and mutual care. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below them, Henry turned to Natalie, his expression more serious than usual. It had been a long day, filled with meetings and decisions, but in this quiet moment, it felt as though time had slowed. He took her hand in his gaze steady, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in the air, an unspoken understanding that this was the turning point. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Henry said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I know we started this journey in a way neither of us ever expected. We were both looking for something different, and I think we found something real. But it's more than that now. It's more than I ever thought it could be." He paused, squeezing her hand gently. "I didn't know what I was missing until you came into my life. You've made me see that there's more to this world than just the business and the power. There's you. There's us. And that matters more than anything." He smiled, a smile that reached his eyes, softer than she had ever seen it. Natalie's heart fluttered in her chest. She had never expected to hear those words, not from him. It wasn't that she didn't think he cared. She had seen the way he had opened up to her, how much he had changed in these months. But to hear him say it out loud, to finally have him acknowledge the depth of their connection, was more than she had hoped for. "Henry," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of awe and affection. "I didn't know what to expect when we first started this. I didn't know if it would even work. But now, I can't imagine my life without you. We've built something real together, and I'm so thankful for that." She looked into his eyes, her heart full. "I want to keep building. I want to keep moving forward with you, wherever this takes us. Because I know now that I'm not just surviving. I'm living with you." Henry's smile deepened, and he leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers. For a moment, they sat in the quiet, feeling the weight of their words settle between them. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were no grand gestures or dramatic promises. But what they had was something far more meaningful, a genuine, lasting connection built on mutual respect, honesty, and love. "I promise you, Natalie," Henry said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "we will face whatever comes next, together. No matter what." He kissed her forehead gently, a promise in that simple touch. As they sat together, watching the city stretch out before them, Natalie realized that this was it. This was the life they had built, step by step, moment by moment. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but they were no longer just living in the shadow of a contract. They were living in the light of something real, something that had grown beyond what they had ever imagined. And as the sun set behind the skyline, they both knew one thing for certain. They were no longer bound by a piece of paper. They were bound by something far stronger, something that had grown out of their willingness to take risks, to open their hearts, and to build a future together. Love wasn't the starting point, but it had become the destination. And for the first time, they both knew they had found their home in each other.